The sun was a hammer at high noon, and the road to perdition was paved with dust. It rose in ghostly plumes with every faltering step Evie Hartwell took, a fine, choking powder that caked her cracked lips and settled in the hollows of her throat. The sky was a vast, bleached-out blue, empty of clouds, empty of mercy. Heat shimmered up from the baked earth, making the horizon tremble and the distant, skeletal shapes of mesquite and cholla dance like specters in her vision. Her world had shrunk to this singular, agonizing rhythm, the scuff of a worn leather sole, the rasp of her own breathing, and the frantic, bird-like flutter of her heart against her ribs. Her traveling skirt, once a respectable navy blue, was now a tattered flag of surrender, ripped at the hem and stained with the alkali sins of the trail. She clutched a small leather satchel to her chest, its seams split, its purpose long since defeated. It was a hollow comfort, a memory of a time when she'd had things to carry. Now, its contents were a single pewter button, smooth and cool against her palm, and a prayer worn thin with repetition. The button was from her father's coat, the last tangible piece of a life that felt as distant as a star. The prayer was a frantic whisper for an end to this road, any end at all. Behind her, the voices came. They were not always real, but they were always present, riding the superheated air like a swarm of angry hornets. Bram Kincaid's voice, smooth and oiled as the cards he dealt, promising security while he shuffled away her future. And Rudd Talbot's, a guttural bark thick with whiskey and entitlement, the voice of the man who believed he had purchased her soul. Their names were bitter coals in her mouth, names she refused to give voice to, lest they become more real than they already were. They spoke of debts she had never signed, of ledgers and figures that had branded her like livestock. The memory of their laughter was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. Sometimes, she would hear the phantom jingle of a spur or the creak of saddle leather, and her blood would turn to ice. She would stumble, turning her head, her eyes wide with a terror that found nothing but the empty, shimmering road. The emptiness was almost worse. It meant they were not gone, only unseen. They were hunting her, and the thought was a spur in her own side, driving her forward past the limits of endurance. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a tick, a tiny, metallic glint against the bruised purple of the distant mesas, a flicker of movement in a world struck dead by the heat. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. A windmill. It grew slowly, resolving itself out of the haze, a skeletal tower, a spinning fan of wooden blades, and atop the derrick, a tin rooster, its tail catching the sun like a defiant flare. Dry Comet Ranch. The name was painted on a faded plank of wood nailed to a gatepost. The fences were lonely, stretching out into the shimmering infinity on either side. But they were upright. They were mended. This was a place someone cared for. The steady, rhythmic tick-thump of the windmill's gears reached her. A slow, mechanical heartbeat in the vast silence. It was the sound of water. It was the sound of life. And in this desolate expanse, it was the promise of a witness. Someone had to be here, a person. Not a ledger, not a contract, but a human being who might see the terror in her eyes and not the price tag on her head. The last 100 yards were a pilgrimage. Each step was a bargain with her own screaming muscles. The shadow of the ranch house porch seemed a mile away, a cool, dark promise she wasn't sure she had the strength to reach. Her vision tunneled, the edges blurring to gray. The windmill's tick grew louder, a metronome counting down her final reserves. She stumbled over an unseen rock, the satchel flying from her grasp. The pewter button clattered against the hard-packed dirt. She fell to her knees, the impact jarring through her bones, and crawled the last few feet, her hands raw, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. She pulled herself up the 2 wooden steps, collapsing into the blessed shade of the porch. The relief was so profound it was dizzying, the sudden coolness on her skin a shock to her sun-scorched system. For a long moment, she lay there, curled on the dusty planks, listening to the pounding of her own blood. And then she heard it. The first human sound. Not a voice, not a footstep, but the simple, deliberate sound of a ceramic cup being set down on a wooden table. It was a quiet sound, a peaceful sound, and it cut through her panic like a clean, sharp knife. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself into a sitting position, her back against the rough-hewn wall of the house. The screen door creaked open. A man filled the frame, his form a dark silhouette against the dim light of the interior. He was broad-shouldered, the fabric of his shirt stretched taut across his back, and as he stepped into the light, she saw a face etched with the kind of weariness that came not just from a long day, but from long years. His beard was thick, streaked with gray, and his eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow, seemed to take in everything at once: her torn dress, her bleeding hands, the frantic pulse beating at the base of her throat. He was, she thought, beard-tired, tired of the sun, tired of the dust, tired of a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. But his hand, as he held the screen door open, was not a tired hand. It was large and calloused, a working man's hand. Yet there was a stillness to it, a lack of aggression that made her breath catch. It was a hand, she thought with a strange, sudden clarity, that remembered gentleness even if the world around it had forgotten. The world tilted violently. The porch boards seemed to sway beneath her like the deck of a ship. A black wave rose up, threatening to pull her under. She swayed, a cry catching in her throat, and pitched forward. He moved with a surprising quickness, closing the distance in a single, long stride. But he didn't grab for her waist, didn't encircle her in a possessive embrace. Instead, his hand closed around her forearm, firm and steady, catching her, grounding her. The contact was a shock not of fear, but of surprise. It was a careful touch, precise and respectful, as if he understood that she was a thing of brittle edges, that the wrong kind of touch might shatter her completely. He held her just long enough for her to find her balance, his grip a silent anchor in her spinning world. "You're safe to sit," he said. His voice was low and raspy, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed, a voice unused to frequent conversation. He offered the shade of his porch before he offered a single question. He guided her to a simple wooden bench near the wall, and as she sank onto it, he remained standing, his presence a silent shield between her and the glaring, hostile world beyond the porch. The wide brim of his hat cast a shadow over her face, a small, welcome eclipse that cooled her burning skin and gave her a moment's reprieve from the relentless sun. He disappeared back into the house for a moment and returned with a folded bundle of blue cotton. He didn't press it into her hands or try to arrange it around her himself. Instead, he gently laid a clean, faded work shirt over her shoulders. His gaze deliberately turned toward the weathered doorframe. The gesture was clear: the covering was hers to accept, to arrange as she saw fit. He was giving her a choice, a small piece of agency in a world that had stripped her of all of it. Evie pulled the shirt around her, the sleeves dangling past her hands. It smelled of lye soap and sunshine, a clean, honest scent that was so far removed from the stale whiskey and cheap cologne of her pursuers that the tears pricked at the backs of her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thick cotton a comforting weight, a barrier. From her seat on the bench, she could see into the house. It was a single room, Spartan and impeccably clean. A black iron kettle sat cold on a wood-burning stove. A simple table was flanked by 2 chairs, one of which had been neatly mended with twine at the backrest. On the far wall, a map of the territory was pinned with 3 brass tacks, marking locations she didn't recognize. It was a life pared down to its essentials, tools, and silence. There were no frills, no decorations, just the quiet dignity of functional things well cared for. It was a lonely room, but it wasn't a sad one. It was a room that knew its own purpose. Her frantic, shallow breathing began to slow, falling into rhythm with the steady tick-thump of the windmill outside. The sound was a lullaby to her frayed nerves, a promise of stability. She was safe, at least for this moment. The story of how she'd come to be here, the whole ugly, terrifying tale, was a hard knot in her chest, lodged behind her teeth like a horse's bit pulled too hard and too long. She didn't know how to begin, or if she even could. The man seemed to understand. He didn't press her, didn't loom over her, demanding an explanation for the human wreckage that had washed up on his porch. He moved to a water barrel at the corner of the porch, dipped a tin cup into the cool, dark water, and brought it to her. "Water first," he said, his voice softer this time. He held the cup out to her. She reached for it, but her hands were shaking so violently she could barely close her fingers around the metal. He saw her struggle, and instead of letting go, he kept his own large hand wrapped around the cup, steadying it as she brought it to her lips. The cup trembled, caught between his stillness and her tremor, a small, shared vessel of humanity. She drank, the water shockingly cold and clean, a blessing that seemed to wash away not just the dust from her throat, but a small measure of the fear from her soul. When she finished, he was still there, his hand covering hers, sharing the weight of the empty cup. And in that quiet, desperate moment, Evie Hartwell allowed herself to believe that she might have found more than just water. She might have found a witness after all. The tin cup was empty, but he didn't take it from her. He simply waited, his large hand a steadying presence over hers, until the last tremor subsided. The silence on the porch was thick, broken only by the rhythmic tick-thump of the windmill blade spinning in the relentless wind. The sound was a clock, measuring a new kind of time. Colt Merrick finally released the cup, his calloused fingers brushing hers in a way that felt accidental, yet deeply grounding. He took the cup, rinsed it with a dipper from the water barrel, and hung it back on its hook. He did not look at her as he spoke. "The sun's no place for this," he said, his voice low. He gestured with his chin toward the open door, the dark, cool interior of the house. It was an invitation, not a command. For Evie, rising from the bench felt like lifting a wagon out of mud. Her legs were water, her head light from the heat and the sudden intake of clean water. He saw her hesitate and stepped closer, offering his forearm again. The same careful, impersonal grip he had used to catch her. She took it, and the strength in his arm was absolute, a solid fact in a world that had become shimmering and uncertain. He guided her across the threshold, and the moment her foot touched the cool floorboards inside, a sob of relief, held back for miles, threatened to break free. She stifled it, swallowing against the hard knot in her throat. He led her to the mended chair by the table. It was the sturdier of the two. She sank into it, her hands gripping the wooden arms. The room was dark after the blinding glare, and it smelled of pine soap, old wood smoke, and something faintly metallic, perhaps the tools he kept by the forge. It was the scent of solitude, of a life lived on its own terms. Colt moved to the stove, not to light it, but to a small pantry built into the wall beside it. He didn't ask her story. He didn't ask her name. He let the silence be her shield, letting her breathe the cool, still air and letting her pulse find the slow, steady rhythm of the house. It was Evie who broke the silence. Her voice was a dry rasp, unfamiliar to her own ears. "Painted Mesa," she whispered, "the county I came from." He stopped, his back to her, but she knew he was listening. "A man there," she continued, the words scraping her throat. "Bram Kincaid. He runs the tables at the Silver Slipper. He trades in futures. He held a marker, not for me, but it didn't matter. He sold my future." She paused, the shame of it a fresh, hot burn. She had to say the rest. The man who had given her water deserved to know what kind of trouble had just crossed his threshold. "The man who claims me. His name is Rudd Talbot. He rides for Juniper Hollow. He's loud with whiskey and he carries a tin badge he didn't earn. He believes the law is whatever he can buy with Kincaid's money." She finished, her breath catching. She had said the names. She had given voice to the hornets, and now she waited for the sting. She expected questions. What marker, why you, what did you do? Colt turned from the pantry, his hands empty. He looked at her, his gaze level, not with pity, but with a profound, assessing quiet. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't ask for details of the ledger. His eyes fixed on the rigid, unnatural line of her posture, the way she held her torso as if it were braced for a blow. That binding, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. The one under your dress. Can you draw a full breath in it? The question was so unexpected, so intensely practical, that it broke through her fear. A corset. He was asking about her corset. In a world that had only cared about the price of her skin, he was asking about her ability to breathe. She looked down, then nodded. A small, jerky motion. It's tight. Then loosen it, he said, turning away again to give her a measure of privacy. This air is free. You should be able to take it in. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled at her side. She didn't have the strength or the leverage to unlace the back, but she found the ties that held the front busk in place. She tugged at the knot, her breath hissing between her teeth. With a final, desperate pull, the laces gave way. The rigid whalebone stays sprang apart, and the pressure on her ribs vanished. Evie gasped, a deep, ragged, shuddering intake of air that was almost painful in its relief. It felt as if she hadn't truly breathed in a month. The release of the physical constriction triggered an emotional one, and a single, hot tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She wiped it away, fiercely. When she looked up, Colt was standing near the cold hearth. He must have gone to a low wooden chest in the corner while she was preoccupied. He set a pair of men's boots on the hearthstones. They were not new, but the leather was thick and well-oiled, the soles intact. They were much too large for her, but that wasn't the point. Your shoes, he said, nodding toward her feet. She looked down. Her traveling shoes were in ruins, the soles split, her feet blistered and bleeding through the thin cotton of her stockings. He was right. She couldn't walk another 10 feet in them. The boots he offered were not hers. Not yet. They were a statement. They were a promise that blisters had an ending, that a person might stay in one place long enough for skin to heal and for leather to be found. They were the most profound kindness she had been shown in a year. While he busied himself, pretending to check the flue on the stove, she let her eyes truly take in his home. This small, quiet room was the man, on the mantel. Above the hearth where the boots now stood was a small, silvered tin type in a simple wooden frame. It was a cavalry photo, a group of young men in ill-fitting uniforms, trying to look brave for the camera. But the photo was turned to face the wall, its back to the room. He did not want to see the faces, or perhaps he did not want them to see him. Beside it lay a folded letter, the paper yellowed and brittle, tied with a black ribbon that had faded to a dusty gray. It was a mourning ribbon, one that had been there for a very, very long time. This house, she realized, wasn't just quiet. It was a house steeped in loss, a place where a man had pared his life down to the tools and the silence because the other things had been taken from him. Colt returned to the table, breaking her study. He placed a thick slice of dark bread on a tin plate and set it in front of her. Next to it, he placed a mason jar half full of preserved peaches, the color of a summer sunset, and a spoon. He sat opposite her, with his own slice of bread and nothing else. For a long moment, he just looked at the table. Then, he bowed his head, his hat still on, and spoke, his voice so low she almost couldn't hear it. For what we have, and for the roof that holds, amen. He wasn't speaking to the ceiling, or to a distant god in the sky. He seemed to be saying grace to the floorboards, to the solid wood beneath their feet. It was a prayer of grounding, not of supplication. She ate. The bread was heavy and sour, but it was food. The peaches were a shock, a burst of impossible sweetness that made her eyes water again. She ate slowly, deliberately, making the simple meal last. Trust wasn't a word. She thought. It was this. It was bread and peaches and a loosened corset and boots set by a hearth. She had just finished the last of the syrup when the sound came, a frantic, angry drumming on the road, growing louder by the second. Hoofbeats, too fast for a casual visitor, too heavy for one horse. Evie flinched, the spoon clattering from her hand onto the plate. Her entire body went rigid. The chair scraped back as she prepared to bolt, her eyes darting to the back window, seeking an escape she knew wasn't there. "Stay," Colt said. It wasn't a command, just a word. He didn't stand. He simply lifted his right palm from the table, the gesture steady, almost lazy. It was a wordless, "I see it, I am aware." He was a man who had heard hoofbeats like this before and had not run. Only then did he rise, slow and deliberate, his movements economical. He didn't reach for the rifle mounted on the wall over the door. He didn't even grab his hat. He just walked to the screen door and stepped out onto the porch, letting the door swing shut with a quiet thwack behind him. Evie crept to the door, peering through the fine mesh of the screen. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard it hurt. Two men sat on horseback just outside the low fence gate, their horses lathered and blowing hard. One was Rudd Talbot, even from a distance. She could see the angry flush of his face, the damp stain of whiskey on his vest. The other man was leaner, his eyes quick and nervous, a follower. Talbot raked the gate with his stare, then fixed it on Colt, who stood on the porch, his hands hanging loose at his sides. Talbot was used to men cowering, or men reaching for their guns. This stillness, this absolute lack of fear or aggression, clearly unnerved him. "I'm here for my property, Merrick," Talbot shouted, his voice cracking with rage. He swung down from his horse, his spurs jangling, and kicked the gate open. The wooden gate slammed back against the fence post with a crack. He stalked into the yard, his hand hovering near the pistol on his hip. "She ain't yours," Colt said. His voice was no louder than it had been at the table, but it carried across the yard with the weight of iron. "I got a bill of sale," Talbot spat, jabbing a finger toward the house, toward Evie, who he must have sensed behind the screen. "Signed by Kincaid himself. She's bought and paid for. Now step aside." Colt didn't move. He just looked at Talbot, his gaze flat and cold. "We don't tally people here." The simple denial, the refusal to even acknowledge the terms of the argument, was more enraging to Talbot than any threat. You damn hermit, you think you can—" Talbot lunged. He didn't go for Colt. He went for the door. He was going to grab Evie and drag her out. It all happened in a fraction of a second. Colt didn't move at him. He moved with him. It was a quick, fluid shift of weight, almost like a dance step. As Talbot barreled past, Colt's boot hooked Talbot's ankle, simultaneously. Colt's hand shot out, not in a punch, but to grab the wrist of Talbot's gun hand, twisting it. Talbot's own momentum did the rest. He was disarmed of his balance and his weapon in the same instant. He pitched forward, his arms flailing, and landed face first in the dusty yard, 6 feet from the porch steps. His pistol, wrenched from his grip, skittered into the dirt near the water barrel. Talbot lay there, stunned, coughing as he spat a mouthful of alkali dust. The road, it seemed, had kept his pride. The second rider's hand flew to his own gun, but he froze when Colt looked up at him. Colt hadn't moved from his spot on the porch. He didn't pick up Talbot's gun. He didn't gloat. He just waited, a silent, unmovable object, with a string of curses. Talbot scrambled to his knees, then to his feet. He was a man undone by his own rage. He snatched up his pistol, his face a mask of purple fury and humiliation. He holstered it, his eyes burning with a hatred that was cold and promising. "This ain't over, old man," he hissed, backing away toward his horse. "Kincaid has the law in his pocket. He'll see this ranch burned to the ground. You hear me, Burned?" He hauled himself into his saddle, yanked the horse's head around, and galloped away, his companion scrambling to follow, leaving only a cloud of settling dust and the echo of his threat. Colt Merrick watched them go, his expression unreadable. He stood there until the sound of the hooves had completely faded, replaced once more by the tick-thump of the windmill. He didn't turn back to the house immediately. Instead, he bent and picked up the splintered piece of the gate Talbot had broken. He looked at it, then tossed it aside. He turned, and his eyes found Evie's through the screen. He didn't check for wounds. He didn't ask if she was all right. He checked her pulse with his gaze alone, a long, steady look that asked one question. "Are you still here?" She nodded, her hand pressed to the screen door, her knuckles white. He nodded back. Once, the business was concluded. He didn't go back to the table. He didn't go to his rifle. He walked to a small, cluttered workbench on the far side of the porch, rummaged in a tin box, and pulled out a single, long iron nail and a hammer. He walked back to the doorway, where she still stood, and knelt. He found a floorboard in the threshold, one that had been slightly loose, one she hadn't even noticed. With 3 precise, deafening blows, he drove the nail into the wood. Clang, clang, clang. The sound was final, an exclamation point on the day. He was fixing a loose board, but he was also setting a new boundary, reinforcing the line that had been crossed. The sound hammered its way into her bones, a clear and unmistakable answer. He stood, put the hammer down, and looked at her. His way of saying, "Stay." The silence that followed the hammer blows was heavier than the heat, thick with unspoken questions and the metallic tang of settled dust. Evie had remained by the screen, her hand still pressed to the mesh, her knuckles white. Colt had returned to the porch bench, not sitting, but resting a hip against the railing, his gaze fixed on the endless, shimmering road. He was waiting. He knew, as she was just beginning to learn, that dust kicked up by humiliation never settles easily. It was perhaps an hour, perhaps only a heartbeat in the long, drawn-out afternoon, when the dust reappeared. This time, it was slower, more deliberate, not the frantic, angry plume of Talbot's retreat, but the measured, inexorable pace of official business. "He kept his word," Evie whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. "He's brought the law." "He's brought a man," Colt said, his voice flat. He straightened, pushing away from the railing, his boots making a solid, definitive sound on the planks. "We'll see if the law came with him." 2 figures resolved out of the heat haze. Rudd Talbot was one, his posture rigid with a borrowed, indignant righteousness. The other man was different. He sat tall in the saddle, his movements economical, his gaze sweeping the ranch as they approached the broken gate, the tracks in the dust, the solitary man on the porch. He wore a dusty black frock coat and a wide-brimmed hat, but the high noon sun glinted off the one thing that set him apart, a 5-pointed star pinned to his vest. A small, dull sun of authority. They stopped at the broken gate, not entering. The man with the badge dismounted, his boots landing with a soft, authoritative thud. He was older than Talbot, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, with steady blue eyes that looked like they'd seen the bottom of too many things. He unhooked the splintered gate from its one remaining hinge and set it carefully against the fence line before walking into the yard. Talbot remained mounted, a king on a throne of simmering rage, his face still streaked with the dirt from his fall. The lawman stopped 10 feet from the porch. His eyes met Colt's. There was no greeting, no smile, but a long, silent beat of recognition passed between them. It was a current of shared history, deep and complex, a mutual understanding forged in bad years that neither of them would ever name. "Colt," the marshal said, a simple acknowledgement that covered a decade. Harlan, Colt replied, his voice equally level. So, they knew each other. Evie felt a knot in her stomach tighten, cold and hard. This was Marshal Harlan Pike, the man who held the county's peace. She had heard his name whispered in Painted Mesa, usually with a mix of respect and fear. He was known for being inflexible, a man who followed the letter of the law, whether it took him to a governor's table or a pauper's ditch. Pike's gaze left Colt and moved to the porch, to the shadows where Evie stood, a figure half hidden by the screen, clutching the borrowed shirt to her throat. He didn't stare at her, not in the way Talbot had. His eyes performed a slow, methodical inventory. He saw the bucket and the water dipper, still damp. He saw the small, clean basin on the bench that Colt had brought out for her hands, now holding a cloth stained with reddish-brown dust. His eyes noted the men's work boots on the threshold, far too large for the woman hiding behind the door. He saw the torn hem of her fine traveling skirt, the way her small, split-seam satchel lay by the chair, its leather scarred as if it had been dragged for miles. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on her wrists, visible where she gripped the doorframe. They were raw, chafed, bright red, the distinct, abraded marks of rope or rough binding. He looked at her face then, meeting her terror with a quiet, neutral expression. He was not accusing. He was not pitying. He was inviting. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly mild, almost gentle. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of ingrained respect. "I'm Marshal Pike. I'm told this man," he gestured over his shoulder with his thumb at the mounted Talbot, "has a claim on you. Name of Evie Hartwell." He spoke her name like a question, but also like a key. He was asking if she was the person named in the complaint, but he was also asking, she felt, if Evie Hartwell was a name she still claimed, a person who still existed, a person with a voice. It was a door held open, inviting her to walk through it and speak for herself. Before Evie could find her breath, Talbot surged forward on his horse, pushing it through the gap where the gate had been. "That's her and she's mine. Pike, I told you. I got the paper." He fumbled in his coat pocket, pulling out a crumpled, sweat-stained document. He waved it like a banner. "A bill of sale, signed and witnessed by Bram Kincaid. She's chattel, collateral on a debt paid in full. She belongs to me." Pike didn't even turn to look at him. His eyes remained on Evie, waiting. "Put that paper away, Rudd," Pike said, his voice dropping an octave, gaining a new, sharp edge of command. "It might be good for wrapping fish in Juniper Hollow, but it's got no ink in Painted Mesa County." "It's legal," Talbot shrieked, his voice cracking. "It's a contract." "It's paper," Pike corrected, finally turning his head just enough to pin Talbot with a cold, blue stare. "We don't trade people for cards in this county, not while I wear this star. The territorial legislature was mighty clear on that last spring. It's called the Anti-Bondage Act. You might want to read it." "Kincaid said it don't apply." "I don't much care what Mr. Kincaid says." Pike cut him off, his patience visibly thinning. "He's not the law here. I am, and I care what she says." He turned back to Evie, his full attention settling on her again. The yard was silent, save for the nervous stamp of Talbot's horse and the windmill's steady tick-thump. Evie felt Colt's presence at her side. He had moved to stand just behind her, just inside the threshold. He was not there to speak, but to be a wall at her back, a silent testament. She gripped the doorframe, the wood cool and solid against her damp palms. She had been a ghost on the road, a shadow on the porch. Now, a United States Marshal was asking her to be a person. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than the whisper she'd used with Colt. It was shaky, raw from dust and disuse, but it was clear, and it carried across the yard with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. "He is lying," she said. Talbot opened his mouth to protest, a stream of invective ready to pour out, but Pike raised a single, gloved hand and Talbot choked on the words. "I am Evie Hartwell," she continued, her gaze locked on the star on Pike's chest, a single point of order in a world of chaos. My father owed Mr. Kincaid a debt. When he passed, Mr. Kincaid came to me. He said I was the payment." She had to stop to swallow the bile of shame and rage that rose in her throat. "This man," she nodded at Talbot, her chin trembling. He won me in a hand of poker, but there were no vows. There was no church. There was just a lock and a ledger. He locked me in a room in the back of the Silver Slipper. I am not his wife. I am not his property. I am his prisoner. I ran." The words hung in the dead, hot air. No vows, no church, just a lock and a ledger. The terrible, simple truth of it. Pike held her gaze for a long time. He was weighing her words, her testimony, against Talbot's paper, against the evidence of the rope burns on her wrists and the terror in her eyes. He was a man of the law, and the law required procedure. He reached into his coat, and Evie's heart sank. He was reaching for his book. He pulled out a small, leather-bound citation book and a pencil. He thumbed through the pages, a deep frown creasing his weathered brow. Evie watched, her hope turning to ash. He was looking for a statute, a number, a line of ink that would tell him what to do. What if Talbot was right? What if Kincaid's paper, however false, held more legal power than her voice? But Pike snapped the book shut, not writing a single word. He put it back in his pocket. He was a man who knew the difference between what was written and what was right. He was using his judgment first. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice formal, as if they were in a courtroom. "The law offers certain protections in cases of disputed contracts, and in cases where a person fears for their safety." He looked directly at her, his blue eyes clear and absolute. "I am asking you, as a marshal of this territory, do you wish to claim sanctuary on this ranch? Do you wish to be placed under the protection of the law, free from the claims of Mr. Talbot?" This was it, the question, the choice. The world seemed to shrink to this single point, this dusty yard, this one man's question. She felt Colt beside her, a mountain of silent support. But he did not breathe a word. He did not nudge her. He did not answer for her. He would catch her if she fell. But he would not make the jump for her. This choice had to be hers, and hers alone, spoken in her own voice. She let go of the doorframe. She stepped from behind the screen, out onto the sunlit porch, squinting against the glare. She was no longer hiding. She was standing in the open, in Colt's overlarge, clean shirt, her feet bare on the warm, dusty planks. "Yes," she said. The word was not loud, but it was the heaviest thing she had ever said. It was full of iron and terror and a new, terrible hope. "Yes, I claim it." A visible wave of something relief, or perhaps just certainty, passed over Marshal Pike's face. He had his answer. He had his grounds. He turned to Talbot, and his entire demeanor changed. The quiet, assessing lawman was gone, replaced by the full, uncompromising authority of the badge. "Mr. Talbot," Pike said, his voice ringing with cold iron that cut through the heat. "You heard the lady. She has claimed sanctuary. That means your business here is concluded. You will hand me your sidearm, but first, and you will vacate this property." "The hell I will!" Talbot roared, his hand instinctively dropping to the pistol on his hip. "She's mine." "You take one more step toward this house or that woman," Pike said, his hand not moving toward his own gun, but simply resting on his belt, a gesture of absolute confidence. "And I will arrest you for coercion. I will arrest you for menacing. I will arrest you for unlawful restraint based on her testimony." And then, Pike added, a flicker of dry, frontier wit in his eyes, "I'll add a charge for writing stupidity just because I can." Talbot froze, his hand hovering over his gun. He was a bully, backed by a bully's money. He was not used to facing a man who was not impressed by either. He looked from Pike's unblinking stare to Colt's silent, solid presence on the porch. He was outnumbered, not by guns, but by a kind of moral certainty he couldn't break. His face, still streaked with dirt, contorted into a mask of pure venom. He knew he was beaten for today. "You're making a mistake, Pike," he hissed, his voice low and simmering with a threat that was worse than his shouting. "That'll be for the judge to decide," Pike said calmly. "Yeah," Talbot sneered, gathering his reins, his hands shaking with rage. "Yeah, it is. And Judge Morrow is an old friend of Bram Kincaid's. We'll see how your sanctuary holds up in a real court." He cast one last, burning look at Evie, a look that promised fire and ruin. "You think this old man can protect you? Kincaid has cousins with rope, and this ranch, it's mighty dry this season. All this dead wood." He yanked his horse's head around, digging his spurs in cruelly. "This ain't over," he screamed back over his shoulder as he galloped away, his companion scrambling to follow, leaving only a cloud of settling dust and the echo of his threat. The dust from Talbot's retreat hung in the air, a sour, gritty fog. Pike watched him go, his jaw tight. He stood in the yard for a long minute, as if listening to the last echo of the threat. Evie finally let out the breath she'd been holding. It felt as though a great iron gate inside her had just creaked open, releasing a pressure that had been building for weeks. She sagged against the doorframe, her legs suddenly turning to water. Colt stepped forward, moving past her onto the porch. He picked up his hat from the bench, dusted it on his knee, and put it on, then nodded once to the lawman. It was a gesture of profound respect, a tip of the hat not just to the badge, but to the man, and to the choice he had allowed Evie to make. Pike walked over, retrieving Talbot's crumpled bill of sale from the dust where he'd dropped it. He folded it neatly and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Evidence," he muttered to himself. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Colt. The bad years were suddenly present in the quiet between them. Evie could almost see the ghosts of shared campfires, the memory of cold nights and hard decisions. "He's not wrong about Morrow," Pike said, his voice low, for Colt's ears only, though Evie, standing in the doorway, heard every word. "The judge is in Kincaid's pocket, this sanctuary claim. It'll hold for now. It'll get her a hearing, buy her time. But Talbot's just a symptom. Kincaid's the sickness." "I know," Colt said. "And Talbot's a coward." Pike continued, his gaze drifting to the dry, brown grass surrounding the ranch, a sea of tinder waiting for a spark. "But a cornered coward is dangerous. He'll do something foolish before Kincaid's cousins even get here. That threat about fire, he meant it." Pike settled his hat on his head. "I can't stay. Colt, I've got to ride back to town. Get this report filed. Send a wire to the territorial judge in Prescott. Get ahead of Morrow if I can. But I'll be circling the rim country for the next few nights. I'll be close." "You'll see smoke before he comes," Colt said, finishing the thought. It wasn't a question. "That's the worry," Pike said. He touched his hat again, this time to Evie. "Ma'am, you're safe for now. Holler if you ain't." He turned, walked to his horse with the steady, measured gait of a man who owned his own boots and knew his own mind, and rode away, not toward Juniper Hollow, but angling west toward the high, cool line of the rimrock. Evie watched him until he was just a speck, a dark dot of integrity against the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence that returned to Dry Comet Ranch was different this time. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a truce, a temporary pause in a war that had just been formally declared. The ranch settled. The chickens, which had scattered into the brush, cautiously returned, pecking at the disturbed dirt. The windmill kept it steady. Rhythmic count, tick-thump, tick-thump. It was the only sound. But the air itself felt different. It was charged, holding the shape of the trouble that had just passed and the promise of the trouble yet to come. It was the same as when you rise from a warm bed on a cold morning. The mattress holds the ghost of your heat for a long time after you've gone, a lingering imprint of life and danger. The immediate threat had passed, but the air was still warm with it. The days that followed were built of small sounds: the scrape of a match in the pre-dawn dark, the groan of a floorboard, the rhythmic tick-thump of the windmill, a sound that had transformed from a beacon of hope into the steady, reassuring heartbeat of a new and fragile life. The war had not ended, but here, inside the quiet perimeter of Dry Comet Ranch, there was an armistice. Mornings began with coffee, a ritual Evie claimed as her own. She would rise before Colt, moving through the gray gloom of the cabin, her bare feet silent on the cool floorboards. She found the coffee grinder, a heavy iron thing that clamped to the table, and the scent of the cracking beans was the first true smell of the day. The kettle became her scepter, the small stove her dominion. She learned the exact moment the water began to simmer, the low hum it made just before boiling. She'd pour it over the grounds, and the cabin would fill with a rich, dark aroma, a smell as strong and uncompromising as the man who lived there. He would emerge from the small sleeping alcove he'd given her, his hair tousled, his eyes still clouded with sleep, and find a steaming mug waiting on the table. He never said thank you in words. He didn't have to. He would just pick up the mug, his large hands wrapping around it, and take a long, slow drink, his gaze fixed on the lightening window. His silent acceptance was a form of gratitude she was beginning to understand. The kettle was her small kingdom, the first piece of the world she had governed in a very long time. One morning, after the coffee, he led her outside. The cistern, a deep, stone-lined well that was the ranch's lifeblood, was covered by heavy wooden planks. A pulley system, old and rusted, was mounted on a thick timber frame above it. "The bucket rope's getting frayed," he said by way of explanation, "and the pulley needs grease." He showed her how to brace her feet, how to use her weight to haul the heavy, waterlogged bucket up from the cool darkness. The old wheel shrieked in protest, a high, metallic squeal that set Evie's teeth on edge. Colt winced at the sound. "Been meaning to fix that for a year," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He handed her the bucket, and she poured the clean, cold water into a trough for the horses. On the second haul, as the pulley hit a particularly high, screeching note, a bubble of something light and unfamiliar rose in Evie's chest. It was a sound so out of place, so alien to the grim silence of her life, that it startled her. She laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, more a bright, breathless cascade of notes that seemed to catch the morning sun and splinter it into 1,000 pieces. Colt froze, his hand on the rope, and turned to look at her. His expression was one of profound, unguarded surprise. It was as if a bird had suddenly started singing in a forgotten language. He stared for a long moment, and a slow, almost imperceptible softening happened around his eyes. He hadn't just heard a laugh, he'd heard a sound the house hadn't heard in years. He cleared his throat and turned back to the pulley, a faint flush rising above his beard. "Needs a lot of grease," was all he said, but the work felt lighter after that. The afternoons were for quiet tasks. The threat of Talbot and Kincaid was a constant, low hum on the horizon, but to dwell on it was to give them power over the present. Evie found purpose in mending. She patched the elbows of Colt's work shirts, her small, neat stitches, a stark contrast to his own rough, functional repairs. One day, tucked away in the bottom of the bread box, she found a small, folded oilskin packet. Inside, wrapped around a piece of cedar, was a spool of deep, indigo blue thread, its color as rich and vibrant as a twilight sky. It was cavalry thread, she realized, the kind used for officers' uniforms. It was too fine for denim or canvas. That evening, she took out a thick wool blanket from the chest at the foot of her bed, a blanket whose edges were frayed and worn. She sat by the light of the fire, the indigo thread a bright slash of color against the gray wool, and began to carefully bind the edges. She was stitching his past, a piece of the life he kept turned to the wall, back into the fabric of his home, making it stronger, warmer. She wondered about the hands that had folded this thread away, about the letter tied with the black ribbon. She didn't ask. She just stitched, her needle rising and falling in the firelight. He, in turn, taught her things, not with long explanations, but with quiet demonstration. He showed her how to read the clouds banking against the mesas, how to tell a rain that would fall from a rain that was only bluffing. He taught her the sable fork knot, a complex but incredibly strong knot used for securing a load or tethering a horse in high wind. He took a length of rope, his calloused fingers moving with an ingrained, fluid grace. He made a loop, then another, tucking the end through in a way that seemed to defy logic. "Your turn," he said, handing her the rope. Her fingers were clumsy at first. The rope was stiff, alien. He didn't take it from her. He knelt beside her chair, his shoulder close but not touching hers. "This loop," he said, his voice a low rumble, "goes under, not over, like this." His large hand guided hers, his touch light, impersonal, yet sending a jolt of warmth through her skin. She tried again, concentrating on the pattern, the precise sequence of movements. The rope resisted. Then, as if by magic, it slid into place. She pulled the end, and the knot cinched down, tight and perfect. It was a beautiful, functional thing. She practiced it over and over, until the movements became her own. Her hands learned the pattern first, and then, slowly, her heart began to learn the lesson the knot was teaching, that with the right tension and the right care, even the most tangled things could be made to hold fast. Her own frantic, frayed nerves began to settle, to find their own steady, reliable knot. Sometimes, in the quiet of the afternoon, she would hum. She didn't even realize she was doing it. It was a half-remembered tune from her childhood in a place called Copper Wren Gulch, a simple, lilting melody that spoke of green grass and clear water. Colt would be at his workbench, oiling a piece of harness or sharpening a blade, and he would pretend not to listen. His movements would not change. His focus would appear unbroken. But later, as dusk settled and he walked out to check on the horses, she would hear it, a low, soft whistle drifting back on the cooling air. It was her melody, picked up and carried, a perfect, whistled harmony that acknowledged her past without ever asking her to speak of it. One hot, windy afternoon, she helped him hang the laundry. They worked in a comfortable silence, the clean, wet sheets snapping in the wind between them. She was wearing his shirt again, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. As she reached up to pin a sheet to the line, a strong gust of wind swept across the yard. It caught the loose fabric of the shirt, lifting it up and away from her shoulders like a blue sail, molding it to her form for a brief, startling moment. Colt, who had been about to hand her another clothespin, froze. He looked, and then quickly looked away, his gaze finding a sudden, intense interest in a loose stone near the fence post. But it was too late. She had seen the look, and she saw how, a moment later, his eyes drifted back, not to her face, but to the sight of his shirt on her shoulders, a look of profound, aching tenderness that he quickly masked. In that moment of looking away, he looked longer and saw more than in all the days before. The sky began to curdle late one evening, the blue deepening to a bruised purple in the west. The air grew heavy, still, charged with the promise of a storm. "It's coming," Colt said, his eyes on the horizon. "We need to cover the hay." They worked together as the wind began to rise, kicking up dust devils that danced across the yard. They wrestled with a heavy canvas tarp, the wind fighting them, trying to rip it from their grasp. They ran the fence line, checking for weak posts, their shoulders brushing in the urgent, shared task. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, not with the gentle hiss of a summer shower, but with angry, sporadic splatters that raised puffs of dust where they landed. They finally secured the last corner of the tarp and ran for the porch just as the sky seemed to split open. But the deluge never came. The storm skirted them, a great dark curtain of rain sweeping across the valley a mile to the south. They were left with nothing but the wind, the smell of distant rain on dry earth, and a fine coating of dust that had been whipped into a frenzy and then abandoned. They stood on the porch, breathing hard, looking at each other. They were filthy, streaked with dust, and the great dramatic effort had been for nothing. And they laughed. It was a shared, breathless laugh, born of absurdity and relief. They were wet, but only with dust, not with water. Later, the world had shrunk to the warm, yellow circle of light cast by the single lamp on the porch table. The crickets had started their nightly chorus. Evie sat on the bench, brushing out her long, damp hair. She had washed it in the basin, and now it hung in a loose, heavy braid down her back, drying in the soft breeze. Colt sat in his chair, leaning back against the wall, sharpening a small knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shk-shk of the stone, a peaceful, domestic sound. He stopped, wiping the blade on a piece of leather. He looked at her, at the way the lamplight caught the drying strands of her hair, turning them to threads of copper and gold. The night air was growing cool. He rose, went inside, and came back with the wool blanket she had mended. He didn't put it around her. He held it out, offering her one end. It was a gesture that hung in the air between them, half distance, half invitation, a way of sharing warmth without trespassing. She took the offered end, her fingers brushing his. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the familiar weight of it, a comfort. He took the other end and settled back in his chair, the blanket now a soft, woolen bridge between them. She watched his hands, resting now on his knees. Nick scars from old mistakes, rope burns from hard work, the gentle way he held the knife, with respect for its edge. These were the hands that had caught her, fed her, taught her, protected her. They were hands that knew how to be strong without being cruel. The question rose in her unbidden, a quiet, vulnerable thing, carried on the cricket song air. "Is it wrong?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the words intended only for him. "If I want warmth more than I want fear." Colt stopped breathing for a second. He looked at the vast, star-dusted darkness beyond the porch light. He thought of Talbot's threats, of Kincaid's ledger, of all the reasons for fear. And he thought of this woman, who had survived it all, asking not for vengeance or for promises, but simply for warmth. His answer, when it came, was not a speech. It was quiet, and it was the truest thing he knew. "Wanting," he said, turning his head to look at her, his eyes dark and serious in the lamplight. "And taking are two different languages." He had given her the answer. He had told her that her wanting was not wrong, and that he would never be a man who simply took. He had placed all the power, all the choice, in her hands. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out, her fingers tracing the air in the small space between them. She let her fingertips graze the back of his knuckles. It was the lightest of touches, a question asked without a single word. He did not pull away. He did not lean in. He did not move closer. He remained perfectly still, a statue of patience, letting her choose the inches, letting her define the space. His stillness was his answer. She let her hand rest there for a long moment. A small, warm weight on his, a fragile, unspoken treaty was signed in the quiet of the porch. A smile, small and certain, touched her lips. She drew her hand back, pulling the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders. Later, when it was time to turn in, he lit a small candle to light her way to the alcove. He stood in the main room as she prepared for sleep. When she was settled, she looked out at him, a silhouette in the flickering candlelight. He raised his hand to snuff the flame. She took a breath at the same moment he did, and in the shared darkness that followed the candle's soft hiss, as their two breaths mingled and settled, each was profoundly aware of the other's nearness, of the invisible line between them, and of the deep, abiding peace that came from knowing it would be honored. The quiet domestic rhythm of Dry Comet Ranch, built over days of shared tasks and honored spaces, shattered with the clatter of a fast-approaching wagon and a voice yelling, "Whoa, steady!" at the broken gate. It was Mary Lark, the mail driver, a man as wiry and restless as the wind he drove through. He handled the reins of his 2 mules with a nervous energy, his gaze darting from the house to the horizon and back again. He was the county's lifeline, a conduit for letters, gossip, and hard news, and today he looked as though he were carrying all 3. Colt met him at the hitching post, Evie standing a few paces behind on the porch, her hands wrapped in her apron. "Mr. Merrick, ma'am," Mary said, touching the brim of his dusty hat, his eyes flicking to Evie with a mixture of pity and curiosity that made her skin prickle. "Got a letter for you. Official." He handed Colt a folded paper, its seal bearing the mark of the marshal's office. But Mary didn't leave. He lingered, twisting his hat in his hands. "That ain't all I'm carrying," he said, his voice dropping. "News, I'm afraid, and none of it good." Colt slit the letter with his thumb, his eyes scanning the contents. "From Pike," he said, his voice flat. "Aye, and Marshal Pike's got his work cut out for him." Mary plunged on, the words tumbling out. "I was at the general store in Juniper Hollow, dropping a parcel, and I heard things. Judge Elgin Morrow, he's in deep with Bram Kincaid, deeper than folks knew. Word is Kincaid holds every marker on the judge's gambling, his house, his wages. Kincaid doesn't ask the judge for favors. Mr. Merrick, he tells him." Evie felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, a feeling she recognized from her days at the Silver Slipper. A corrupt judge meant Pike's badge was just a piece of tin. The sanctuary she had claimed was built on sand. "There's more," Mary said, stepping closer, his voice barely a whisper. 2 men, strangers, asking questions at the livery, names of Knox and Plume Talbot, Rudd's cousins. They're saying they were asking about you, ma'am." He looked at Evie, his face grim. "And then they went to the general store, and they bought oil, 4 5-gallon cans of it. And they were asking Silas, the clerk, if he had a territorial map, one that showed the fence lines of Dry Comet Ranch." The air went still. The tick-thump of the windmill sounded unnaturally loud. A clock counting down to a dark hour. Oil cans. A fence map. The threat Talbot had spat into the dust was no longer the rambling of a drunken bully. It was a plan. Colt folded Pike's letter, his knuckles white. He looked at Evie, his gaze hard, but not at her. At the situation, "What's in the letter, Colt?" she asked, her voice steady. He handed it to her. The script was spare. Pike's handwriting as economical as his speech. "Colt, Talbot's cousins are in town. Stay sharp. Keep your stock in the south pasture, close to the bluffs. They're looking at your fences. I smell a stampede plan. I'm riding the rim. H.P. A stampede. They weren't just going to burn the house. They were going to destroy his livelihood, scatter his herd, ruin him completely, and the fire would be the tool to do it. "The town," Evie said, her voice small. "What are they saying in town?" "Mr. Lark." Mary looked at his boots, deeply uncomfortable. "It's split, ma'am. You understand. Folks in Juniper Hollow, they don't like trouble. Some are saying you brought this on, that you're to blame for men's sins, for stirring up Kincaid." Evie flinched, the words a physical blow. She was the problem. The woman who had run, who had dared to say no. "But not all," Mary added hastily, reaching into his mailbag. "Not by a long shot. Some folks see this for what it is, a land grab, with you as the excuse." He pulled out a small, lumpy parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Willa Thorne, the seamstress, she pressed this into my hand, asked me to leave it for you, at the livery, so folks wouldn't see." He handed the parcel to Evie. It was still warm. She unwrapped the paper, Inside was a small loaf of fresh, dark bread, studded with seeds. It was a simple, heavy, real thing, a testament. Others might whisper, but Willa Thorne had baked bread. It was a quiet, flour-dusted act of defiance. Evie clutched the loaf to her chest, her throat tight. The community's stakes were no longer abstract. They were being drawn, line by line, in whispers and in bread. Mary Lark nodded. His duty done. You watch yourselves. Mr. Merrick, ma'am, these are bad men, and they've got the law on their side of the street, if not on their side of right. He climbed back onto his wagon and, with a flick of the reins, was gone, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy, suffocating silence. The ranch was no longer a refuge. It was a target. That evening, the domestic peace was replaced by a grim, focused purpose. Colt moved his cattle, as Pike had advised, into the smaller south pasture, a box canyon with high bluffs on one side and a single, wide gate. He checked the hinges on that gate, his movements deliberate. He cleaned his rifle, the snick-snick of the oiled rag a sharp, metallic sound in the twilight. I'll take the first watch, he said, not looking at her. He was checking the site. You'll stay in the house. Lock the door. If you hear anything, you don't come out. You go to the root cellar, through the trap door. You wait till I come for you. Evie, who had been packing a small bag with the bread, a canteen, and a box of matches, stopped. She looked at the man who had offered her his shirt, who had taught her his knots. The woman he was describing, the one who would hide in a hole, was not the woman standing in his kitchen. No, she said. He looked up, his brow furrowed. Evie, this isn't a discussion. These men are coming with oil and matches. I know what they're coming with, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. I was a prisoner for a month. Colt, I'm not going to be one again, not even for my own safety. I won't hide in the dark. I'll take a shift. I can hold a lantern as well as a man. He stared at her, a complex battle playing out in his eyes, his instinct to protect her warring with the undeniable respect she had earned. He saw the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine. She was not the broken thing that had collapsed on his porch. She was a mended, hardened thing. You hold the lantern, then, he conceded, his voice rough. But you hold it from the porch. The porch, Evie, that's the line. I'll walk the perimeter. The first watch was tense. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving the world in shades of indigo and charcoal. Evie sat on the top step of the porch, the unlit lantern beside her. Colt was a ghost, a shadow moving between the deeper shadows of the barn and the fence line. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound, it was the lack of one. The windmill, which had been turning in the evening breeze, tick-thump, suddenly fell half-silent. The tick-thump of the gears continued, but the rhythmic squeak-splash of the pump rod filling the cistern trough was gone. Evie stood. Colt, she hissed into the darkness. He materialized at her side in an instant. What? The water. The pump. It stopped. He was already moving, not toward the windmill, but toward the main water line. A thick leather pipe that ran from the cistern to the cattle troughs. Evie grabbed the lantern, lit it, and followed. They found it halfway to the barn, a low, steady hissing, like a snake in the dust. Colt lowered the lantern. A dark, spreading stain soaked the ground. The leather line had been slit, a clean, 9-inch gash, deliberately cut. It was sabotage, a test, an attempt to drain their water, to draw them out. They're here, Colt whispered. They're close. We have to plug it, Evie said, her mind racing. We'll need all the water we have if they... She couldn't say fire. Rope won't hold the pressure, Colt said, assessing the damage. I need wood. A clamp. No time, Evie said. She looked at the gushing line, then ran back to the house. She burst through the door, grabbed the large curved metal feed scoop from the bin by the stove, and a ball of thick twine. She was back in a moment. "Here," she panted, thrusting it at him. "The curve. It's like a saddle. It will cover the slit. We can bind it." Colt saw her meaning instantly. It was clever. It was wit. He knelt in the mud, forced the two edges of the slit together, and Evie pressed the concave metal of the scoop hard over the wound. The hissing lessened. "Hold it," he commanded. He took the twine, his hands moving with the same deftness she'd seen in his knot tying, wrapping it, pulling it, cinching it with a speed and ferocity that left her breathless. He lashed it tight, his knuckles brushing the mud, until the hissing stopped completely. Reduced to a mere dribble, it would hold. For now. They stood, breathing hard, their hands muddy, united by their small victory. But the victory was cold. The enemy was inside the wire. They retreated to the porch, their senses screaming. The night was alive now, hostile, and then it came. From the north ridge, a high, thin yip, a coyote, Evie thought, her heart pounding. Colt laid a hand on her arm, his grip like iron. "Wait." Silence. Then, from the east, an answer. A yip-yip howl. "That's no coyote," Colt whispered, his voice a low growl. "That's a man, and a bad one at that, trying to sound like one. They're signaling, Knox and Plume. They're in position. They're sloppy." The sound, the arrogance of it, the way they used the night as a cloak, it triggered something in Evie, a memory, sharp and sudden, from the back room of the Silver Slipper, the smell of stale whiskey and bay rum. Bram Kincaid at his desk, his hand moving over his ledger. "Colt," she said, her voice urgent. "The judge! Judge Morrow!" "What about him?" "Kincaid's ledger. He kept it. It was his Bible. He had symbols for his high-value accounts, men who owed him more than money, and Judge Morrow. He didn't just have a number by his name." Evie pushed past him, into the house, to the map pinned to the wall. She grabbed a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth. "What was it?" "Evie," Colt asked, standing in the doorway, his silhouette a dark block of muscle. "It was a star," she said, her hand shaking as she sketched a small, five-pointed star in the margin of the map. "A star, right next to his name. Kincaid owns him. Pike. Pike can't win in his court. It's a closed trap." Colt stared at the star. The full weight of their isolation settled on him. Pike's law was neutered. Mary's news was true. They were alone. "No," Colt said, his voice hardening. "We're not. Pike is out there. He's riding the rim. He can't use Morrow's court, so we have to make a new one." "What do you mean?" "They're coming with oil," he said, thinking aloud, his eyes on the map. "They're coming to the south pasture. Pike is in the cottonwoods, just south of there. He's waiting for smoke." "But by then, the herd will be gone," Evie said. "Exactly, so we don't let them light the fire. We let them try." The plan began to form, a desperate, brilliant piece of frontier logic. "We have to catch them, not just stop them. Evie, we have to catch them in the act. Catch them with their own oil, their own matches, with flame marks on their boots. We have to give Pike evidence so clean and so public that even a bought judge like Morrow can't sweep it away." A new, terrifying silence filled the room as Evie understood. They weren't just defending, they were setting a trap. "They'll be looking for me," Evie said, her voice low. "Rudd's cousins. They'll be looking for the woman who shamed him." "They'll be looking for me," Colt countered, "thinking I'm asleep." "Let them find me instead," she said. Colt's head snapped up. "No, I won't have it. I won't use you as bait." "You're not using me. I'm volunteering. It's the only way. Colt, they think I'm weak. They think I'm a victim. If they see me, alone, by the south gate, they'll get greedy. They'll get sloppy. They won't just set the fire, they'll try to take me. It will pull them out of the shadows and into the open, right where Pike can ride in from the cottonwoods. She was pleading now, her hands gripping his forearm. It's the only way to give him the witness he needs. Colt looked at her, his face a mask of warring emotions. He hated the risk. It made him physically ill to think of it, but he loved, with a fierce, sudden, and overwhelming force, the courage of the woman standing in front of him. She was right. It was a terrible plan, and it was the only plan. He put his large, calloused hand over hers, his thumb brushing the skin. All right, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he wouldn't name. A compromise, my way. You hold the lantern. You are the lure. You walk the fence line, just as you said. Evie felt a surge of relief, but he wasn't finished. But you don't walk it alone, he said, his gaze locking with hers, a promise of iron. I'll be in the shadow of the fence, 10 feet behind you, every step. They won't see me. They won't know I'm there until their hands are full. You hold the lantern, Evie, but I hold the line, beside you. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He was not sending her. He was going with her. It was a partnership, forged in shared danger. Good, Colt said, his voice all business again. He released her hand and grabbed a length of rope from a hook. Now, let's go set a trip line by that south gate, and I have an idea how to make sure their matches don't strike quite right the first time. The night spilled over the high desert like cold, dark water, swallowing the mesas and drowning the canyons in absolute shadow. The stars, scattered across the ink-black sky, seemed impossibly bright, sharp as chips of ice, but they offered no usable light. The only illumination on Dry Comet Ranch was a single, moving circle of yellow, cast by the tin and glass lantern Evie Hartwell carried. Her footsteps were the loudest sound in the world, the scuff of the heavy boots Colt had given her, the thud as her heels struck the hard-packed earth, the faint rustle of her skirt. The quiet was a living thing, a predator holding its breath. It was loud, heavy, and full of listening. She walked the perimeter of the south pasture, just as they had planned. She held the lantern high, swinging it in a slow, deliberate arc, making herself a beacon, a target. Her silhouette, tall and unmistakably female, was painted against the dark slats of the pasture gate. Behind that gate, she could hear the herd shifting, a low rumble of body against body, the soft stamp of hooves. The cattle were restless, smelling the strange, acrid tang in the air that Evie was just beginning to notice herself. She was terrified, but a new, cold clarity had settled over her. This was not the frantic, scrambling fear of a victim. This was the sharp, focused fear of a hunter in a blind. 10 feet behind her, moving in perfect lockstep with her, swallowed by the deeper shadow of the fence posts, was Colt. She could not see him. She could not hear him, but she felt his presence, a solid, grounding weight that kept her hand steady on the lantern's wire handle. He was the line she would not cross, and the wall at her back. The first sound that didn't belong was a displaced stone, a small, sharp skitter-click from the dry wash that ran along the property's northern edge. Evie's breath hitched. She forced herself to keep walking, to keep the lantern swinging in its calm, even rhythm. Then whispers, low and guttural, like gravel rolling in a sack. "Quiet, you fool," a voice hissed. "You want him to hear you coming." "It's dark as a tomb out here," another voice, thicker and slower, complained. "Shut up, both of you. Just get the oil to the troughs." "Rudd Talbot." His voice was a rasp of whiskey and spite. He was here. 3 shadows detached themselves from the deeper blackness near the wash. They moved in a low crouch, 2 bulky figures in the lead, 1 leaner figure hanging back, directing. Knox and Plume Talbot, the cousins, were as large and menacing as Mary Lark had described. Each carried a 5-gallon oil can, the metal glinting faintly when the lantern light brushed them. The slosh of the liquid inside was a sickening sound, a liquid threat that promised fire. Talbot, the chief general, pointed. Plume, you start at the troughs. Douse 'em good. Knox, you take the gateposts and the fence line. I want a wall of fire. When I give the signal, we light it, and the herd will do the rest. They'll trample the house, the barn, everything. We'll be halfway to Juniper Hollow before they even see the smoke. What about the woman, Rudd? Knox muttered, pausing. The light. That's her, ain't it? If she's stupid enough to be out here, she's ours. Talbot sneered, his hand moving to the coiled rope on his hip. Kincaid wants her quiet, one way or another. Now, move. The two men crept forward, splitting apart. Evie held her breath. She could smell the oil now, a sharp, chemical stink that burned her nose. She heard the glug 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 as Plume upended his can into the long wooden water trough. Knox began splashing the thick liquid onto the dry timbers of the main gate. They were committing the act. They were painting the ranch with its own destruction. A quarter-mile south, hidden in a dense stand of cottonwoods that marked the creek bed, Marshal Harlan Pike sat his horse, still as a stone carving. He had watched the lantern light's slow patrol. He saw the 3 figures emerge from the wash. He saw the glint of the cans. He heard the faint sound of their voices, the orders. His gaze was steady, his face a mask of iron-gray patience. He was counting men, counting sins, letting the rope of their crimes play out until it was long enough and strong enough to hang them. In the fence-line's shadow, Colt Merrick was a coiled spring. He pressed his body flat against a thick post, his eyes locked on the men. He watched them pour the oil. He watched Talbot step out from the shadows, his eyes fixed on Evie's form, a predatory hunger in his stance. Colt's muscles screamed to act, to charge, to end this. But he waited. Not yet. He needed the final, undeniable act. Talbot, satisfied with his cousin's work, turned his full attention to the gate and to the woman who stood before it, seemingly frozen in terror. He drew his pistol, then seemed to reconsider, holstering it in favor of the rope. It was more personal. Well, well, he called out, his voice slick with triumph. Look what we have here, the runaway bird. Come out to see the fire. He started walking toward her, uncoiling the rope, his spurs jingling softly. It's over, Evie. You should have stayed put. You're coming with... That was the signal. Colt didn't yell. He simply stomped his boot down on the trip line he had buried in the dust. The mechanism sprang. A 50-pound sack of feed rock, suspended from a beam, dropped. The rope snapped taut, and with a sound like a small cannon shot. A secondary gate, a massive drag gate built of heavy, interlocking timbers that Colt had hidden in the darkness inside the main pasture, slammed shut. It sealed the herd's only exit. The cattle, already spooked by the smell of oil and the sudden, loud noise, surged forward as one. They bellowed, a wave of panic and thundering hooves, but they slammed into the solid, unmoving wall of timber. The stampede was denied. They were contained. What in the... Knox yelled, spinning around. Talbot, confused and enraged, saw his plan collapsing, his fury robbed of its grand design. Focused on the only target he had left, he forgot the fire, he forgot the herd. He saw only Evie, the lantern, the source of his humiliation. You! He roared, and he lunged, launching himself across the last 20 feet, his hand outstretched, not with the rope, but to grab her. He never touched her. Colt exploded from the shadows like a force of nature. He had been 10 feet behind her, but he covered the distance in 2 silent, pounding strides. He met Talbot midway, a broad-shouldered, unmovable object. This was not a barroom brawl, full of wild, swinging punches. This was the cold, brutal arithmetic of a man who had seen worse wars. Colt's first blow was not a punch to the jaw. It was a short, hard, piston-like strike to Talbot's solar plexus. The air left Talbot's lungs in a single, gagging whoosh as Talbot doubled over, gasping. Colt's hand clamped onto the back of his neck, his other hand seizing Talbot's gun wrist, twisting it, using Talbot's own forward momentum. Colt slammed him face down into the dust, driving his head into the muddy, oil-slick pool his cousins had just created. The entire confrontation was over in less than 3 seconds, the instant the drag gate slammed. Evie had known her part. She didn't scream, she didn't drop the lantern. She held it high and swung it in a wide, desperate circle over her head. Once, twice. The light arced wildly, illuminating the entire scene in frantic, flashing detail that contained panicked herd, Knox and Plume frozen in disbelief, Colt standing over the fallen, muddy form of Rudd Talbot. It was not a weapon, it was a signal. It was a spotlight for the witness in the trees. "It's a trap! It's Pike! He's coming!" Plume shrieked, finally seeing the distant, unmistakable shape of a rider galloping from the cottonwoods. Knox, the more feral of the two, didn't hesitate. He dropped his empty oil can and bolted, scrambling back toward the darkness of the wash. A large man running with the desperate speed of a coward. "Light it. Plume, light the fire. You idiot." Talbot gurgled from the mud, still pinned by Colt's knee on his back. "Light it." Plume, trapped between the advancing marshal and his cousin's order, panicked. He fumbled in his vest pocket, his hands shaking violently. He pulled out a small, pasteboard matchbox. He clawed one out, struck it against the side. Sst! A tiny flare of blue, a sputter of sulfur, and it died. "Damn it!" He struck another. Hiss, sputter. Nothing. The splint was damp, useless. "The oil's... it's wet. Rudd, it won't light," Plume cried, his voice cracking in terror. "The matches are wet, you fool," Talbot roared, thrashing in the mud. Evie's heart hammered in her chest. It had worked. While Colt had been rigging the trip line, she had done her own work. She had remembered seeing Talbot buy the box of matches at the general store. She'd found their gear stashed in the tack room. With trembling fingers, she had opened the box, taken a small tin of axle grease, and carefully, meticulously, coated the head of every single match, wiping it just clean enough to look unused. They were soaked splints, perfectly preserved and utterly useless. "Drop the box, son, slowly." The voice cut through the night, as cold and clean as the starlight. Marshal Harlan Pike reined in his horse, which danced nervously at the smell of the oil. He didn't have his gun drawn. He sat in his saddle, a figure of absolute authority, holding a pair of heavy iron cuffs that glinted in the lantern light. Talbot, seeing the cuffs, gave a final, desperate heave. He was coated in the evidence. His boots were soaked in oil. His trousers were black with it. His face was a mask of it. Suddenly, a new sound came from the wash, a strangled yelp, a heavy crash, and a string of vivid curses. A moment later, a new figure stepped into the edge of the light, dragging Knox by his collar. The big man was sputtering, his shirt torn. It was Mary Lark, the mail driver, his face pale but determined, his wiry frame vibrating with adrenaline. He was holding the heavy leather strap of his mail bag. "Found this one trying to sneak back to his horse. Marshal," Mary panted, giving Knox a shake. He tripped right over my mail strap. I was just checking, in case you needed a witness. Marshal." The town had quietly, definitively, chosen its side. "Good work, Mr. Lark," Pike said, his voice level. He dismounted, his boots landing with a solid thud. He turned his attention to Plume Talbot, who had his hands raised so high they were trembling. "It wasn't me, it was him, it was all him," Plume blubbered, pointing a shaking finger at Talbot. He made us him, and Kincaid said it was all fixed. He said Judge Morrow would clear it, that he'd sign the writ, call it a justified seizure. He said the judge would rule the ranch was forfeit, on account of Mr. Merrick, on account of him harboring her. Pike's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped. He looked at the oil-soaked ground. The terrified man, the damning evidence, and the name Morrow finally spoken aloud, connecting the last piece. Conspiracy, Pike said, the word flat and cold. He pulled the cuffs from his belt and snapped them onto Plume's wrists. He moved to Talbot, yanking him to his feet. Rudd Talbot, you're under arrest for attempted arson, conspiracy to defraud, and menacing. And that's just for starters. Colt finally stepped back, his chest heaving. The danger, so sudden and total, had passed, leaving a vacuum in its wake. As he turned toward Evie, the lantern light caught a dark, wet streak on his cheekbone. In the brief, violent scuffle, Talbot's flailing hand, or perhaps a ring he wore, had cut him. "You're bleeding," Evie said. Her voice was a whisper, her body shaking now that the need for courage had passed. She set the lantern on the ground. Her hands, which had been so steady, fumbled in her skirt pocket for the clean bandana she carried. "It's nothing," Colt said, his voice rough, but he stood still as she stepped toward him, into the circle of his warmth. She was inside his space now, the air between them charged. She could smell the dust on him, the clean scent of soap, and the faint, metallic tang of his blood. She reached up, her hand tentative, and gently pressed the folded square of cotton to the cut. It was a small wound, but it was on his face, on his skin. "Hold it," she whispered. He didn't move. He just watched her, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. "Evie," he breathed, the word a mix of exhaustion and something else, something she couldn't name. Her hand lingered. Her fingers, pressing the cloth, rested against the rough stubble of his jaw. The touch was meant to be practical, a simple act of care, but it became something more. It was a question, an answer, a statement. It lasted one breath, 2 breaths, longer than was strictly necessary. He closed his eyes for that brief second. A man surrendering not to a foe, but to a kindness. Pike cleared his throat, a sound that was both discreet and commanding. The moment was broken. He had Knox and Plume secured to their own saddles. "Mr. Lark, I'll need you to ride with me. You're a witness to this confession." "Yes, sir. Marshal right with you." Pike turned, settling his hat. He looked at Colt and Evie, standing close in the yellow light, surrounded by the tools of a failed, malicious plot. The star-cold sky above was a vast, silent, and impartial witness. "His kind," Pike said, nodding at the prisoners. "They prefer the dark. They like a vigil, a fire in the night. But we're going to bring this all the way into the light." He looked at Evie, his gaze steady, acknowledging her courage, her part in the trap. "Court," he said. The word was not a question. It was a promise. "Not vigil?" Evie looked at Rudd Talbot, muddy, cuffed, and defeated, his eyes burning with a hatred that no longer frightened her. She had run from him. She had hidden from him. She had lured him. And now she would face him. She met Marshal Pike's gaze, her chin high, her voice clear and steady in the cold night air. "Court." The Juniper Hollow courthouse was not a grand hall of justice. It was a single, large room built of pine that had long since surrendered its fresh scent to the years. It smelled of things that lasted old paper, stale ink, and the fine, gritty dust that filtered in through the tall, wavy glass windows, a constant reminder of the world outside the law. But today, the room was full. The hard wooden benches, usually empty save for a few bored loafers, were packed tight. Ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder with merchants from the town's single street, their faces grim and sun-creased. Willa Thorne, the seamstress, was there, her hands folded primly in her lap, her expression one of quiet, unshakable resolve. Mary Lark sat beside her, his nervous energy contained for once, his mailbag resting at his feet like a loyal dog. Even a row of young boys, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their Sunday hats, sat at the back, their eyes wide, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a long, long time. The entire county, it seemed, had come to see if a man's ledger held more weight than a woman's soul. Evie sat in the front row between Colt and Marshall Pike. She wore a simple calico dress Willa Thorne had pressed into her hands that morning, a loan that felt like a suit of armor. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingers laced together to still their trembling. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the judge's empty bench, a block of dark, scarred wood that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Colt sat beside her, not touching, but a solid, warm presence. He was as still as the granite bluffs that bordered his land, a silent witness in a room full of whispers. The side door opened, and Judge Elgin Morrow swept in, his black robes flowing behind him. He was a man who had gone soft in the middle, his face florid, his eyes small and perpetually annoyed, as if the very act of dispensing justice was an imposition on his time. He settled into his high-backed chair, the leather groaning under his weight, and surveyed the packed room with a look of disdain. He picked up his gavel. Crack! The sound was sharp, imperious. "This court is now in session," he announced, his voice booming with a false authority. He banged the gavel again, with the unearned confidence of a man who already knows the verdict because he has already been paid for it. "We are here to hear the complaint of Mr. Rudd Talbot regarding the flight and recovery of contracted chattel." The word chattel landed in the room with a sickening thud. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Pike rose slowly, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor, the Territory has filed charges against Mr. Rudd Talbot, Mr. Knox Talbot, and Mr. Plume Talbot for attempted arson, conspiracy and menacing based on the events of last night." Morrow glared down at him. "Those are serious charges. Marshal, you'd best have more than the word of a runaway." "I do, Your Honor," Pike said calmly. He walked to the long table before the bench and began to lay out his evidence, each piece a nail in the coffin of Morrow's corrupt authority. He placed the 2 5-gallon oil cans on the table, their sides still streaked with mud. They made a hollow, damning sound as he set them down. Next to them, he placed the pasteboard box of matches, its contents useless and soaked. Finally, he unrolled a sheet of paper and smoothed it flat. "This," Pike said, his voice ringing with clarity, "is the signed and witnessed statement of Plume Talbot, confessing to the plan to set fire to the Dry Comet Ranch, with the intent of causing a stampede to destroy the property of Mr. Colt Merrick. The statement details that they were acting on the direct orders of his cousin, Rudd Talbot." The room leaned forward as one, a collective body straining to see, to hear, to bear witness. Judge Morrow's face had gone a shade darker. He looked from the oil cans to the confession, his composure beginning to crack at the edges. It was at that moment that the main doors at the back of the courthouse swung open. Bram Kincaid slithered in, pausing on the threshold to let every eye in the room find him. He was dressed in a tailored suit of charcoal gray, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He smelled of bay rum and winnings, a scent of cheap luxury and moral decay. He surveyed the room, his thin lips curling into a smile as he took in the scene. He was not a participant. He was the proprietor. His gaze met Judge Morrow's, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent reminder of favors owed and debts to be collected. Then, his eyes swept the benches, counting the faces, mentally tallying the men who owed him money, the businesses that depended on his credit, the souls he held on his ledger. He was counting the faces he owned. He glided down the aisle and took a seat directly behind Rudd Talbot, who sat cuffed and sullen between two deputies. Kincaid leaned forward and whispered something in Talbot's ear, a serpent's hiss of reassurance. Morrow, bolstered by Kincaid's presence, regained his bluster. "A confession from a coward trying to save his own skin is hardly conclusive, Marshal," he sneered. "This is a simple property dispute. The woman," he gestured dismissively toward Evie, "is bound by a contract her father signed. The law must protect the sanctity of such agreements. It is the foundation of order." Pike turned. "Your Honor, I would like to call Miss Evie Hartwell to speak." "On what grounds?" Morrow demanded. "The chattel has no standing." "On the grounds that she is a human being and a citizen of this territory, not an object," Pike said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she is the victim of a crime." Before Morrow could object further, Evie stood. She did not wait for permission. She felt Colt's hand briefly touch the small of her back, a fleeting, steadying pressure. And then it was gone. She stood tall, her hands at her sides, and faced the judge. The terrified woman who had stumbled onto Colt's porch was gone. The whispering ghost from the back of the silver slipper was gone. Her voice, when it came, was as clear and steady as the desert sky after a storm. "My name is Evie Hartwell," she said, her gaze unwavering. "My father was a good man who made a bad deal with Mr. Kincaid. When my father died, Mr. Kincaid told me I was part of the debt. I was kept in a locked room. I was traded in a card game." She paused, letting the ugly words settle in the silent room. "Your Honor, you speak of contracts in order. In Mr. Kincaid's ledger, I was listed next to a wagon axle that was also owed to him. I was given the same value." She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with a truth that was more powerful than any law written in a book. "I was ledgered like a wagon axle. I am not an axle." A profound silence followed. The simple, devastating dignity of her statement was a stone dropped into the corrupt waters of the courtroom. Judge Morrow's face contorted in a sneer. "Your sentimental speeches are irrelevant. Miss, this court is concerned with protecting the established order, not with the melodramatic complaints of a debtor. Order isn't for sale." The voice came from beside Evie. Colt had risen to his feet. He did not shout. He did not gesticulate. He stood in his clean but worn work clothes, a man of dust and dignity, and his calm, quiet words carried more weight than all of Morrow's blustering. He was not making an argument. He was stating a fundamental truth, and in doing so, he was passing judgment on the judge himself. "Sit down, Mr. Merrick," Morrow roared, banging his gavel. "You are out of order." "Your Honor," Pike interjected smoothly, stepping forward. "I have other witnesses." He turned to the crowded benches. "I call Mrs. Willa Thorne." Willa Thorne stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the front, her back ramrod straight. She stood before the bench and spoke in a voice that was accustomed to measuring seams and speaking truth. "Judge," she said, "I have a small window in the back of my shop. It looks out over the alley behind the Silver Slipper. On the evening of the 3rd of this month, after dark, I was working late. I saw Mr. Talbot here drag a woman from a back door of the saloon. She was struggling. He had her by the elbow, and he forced her into the freight room and locked the door from the outside. The woman was Miss Hartwell." Kincaid's smile tightened at the edges. Morrow's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. "Hearsay and gossip from a nosy seamstress," Morrow barked. "I call Mr. Mary Lark," Pike said. Mary stood, his nervousness replaced by a kind of focused indignation. He held up a small, tagged bundle of fibers. "Your Honor, when Marshal Pike asked me to witness the confession, I also went and looked at the room Miss Hartwell described, the rope they used to bind her hands for transport. She said it was a new rope from the general store, and it was, but it was tied with a double figure-8 bend." He paused for effect. It's a knot a sailor or a mule skinner might use. Rudd Talbot, sober or drunk, couldn't tie that knot if his life depended on it. But Bram Kincaid, Mary said, turning to look directly at the man in the charcoal suit. Spent 5 years working the riverboats out of St. Louis. I'd wager he knows that knot better than he knows his own mother. Kincaid's mask of composure finally slipped. A flicker of cold fury flashed in his eyes. "This is a circus," Morrow bellowed, his voice cracking. "A collection of unrelated anecdotes and baseless accusations. I will not have my courtroom turned into a stage for this. This personal vendetta against respected members of our community. All this testimony is irrelevant to the matter of the contract. I find for the complainant, Mr. Talbot. The charges against him and his associates are dismissed, Marshal. You will return the property to its rightful owner." He raised his gavel to deliver the final, damning blow. "I wouldn't do that, Judge," Pike said, his voice like the click of a pistol hammer being cocked. He reached into his coat and produced not a gun, but a folded document. It was a government circular, printed on heavy paper, bearing the seal of the United States Territorial Office. "This circular," Pike announced, his voice filling the suddenly silent room, "arrived on the morning stage. It was wired from the Capitol. It is Federal Circular 72, an emergency clarification of the Anti-Bondage Act of 1867. It explicitly states," Pike read, "that no contract, verbal or written, which trades a human being as chattel, security, or payment for any debt, is considered legally binding in this territory. All such contracts are null and void, and any attempt to enforce them is a federal offense, punishable by imprisonment." He refolded the document. "It seems, Your Honor," he said, his eyes boring into Morrow's, "that this isn't a matter of local order. It's a matter of federal law." A low, deep murmur rolled through the courtroom, the sound of held breath being released, the sound of thunder held back and finally breaking. The foundation of Morrow's authority had just been dynamited. Kincaid's ledgers were now just books full of bad ink. Bram Kincaid was on his feet, his face pale, his composure shattered. He saw the game was lost, the trap sprung. He leaned over, hissing at his pawn. "Talbot, sit tight. Don't move. Say nothing." But Rudd Talbot was not a man for sitting tight. He was a creature of whiskey, rage, and cowardice. He saw the ranchers on the benches staring at him with cold contempt. He saw Willa Thorne's look of righteous satisfaction. He saw the federal law in Pike's hand and the iron cuffs on his own wrists. He saw the cage closing. He bolted. With a wild cry, he shoved his chair back and scrambled for the aisle, a desperate, clumsy bid for the open door. Crack, crack, crack. Judge Morrow hammered his gavel, his face a mask of impotent fury. "Order, order in this court." Chaos opened. People on the benches gasped and recoiled. The deputies moved to intercept, but Talbot had a head start. Colt Merrick did not run. He did not shout. He moved without bluster. A quiet, efficient pivot. As Talbot scrambled down the aisle, Colt simply took one step from the end of the bench, placing himself directly in the path. Talbot, his eyes wild, his gaze fixed on the promise of the door, didn't see him until it was too late. He crashed into Colt's solid frame as if he'd run into a stone wall. The impact sent him stumbling backward, his arms windmilling for balance. His boot heel caught on the base of the oil can Pike had left on the floor. He went down in a clattering, ignominious heap, landing amidst the primary evidence of his own crime. Before he could even think to rise, Marshal Pike was there. The quiet, final click-click of the cuffs locking around Talbot's wrists echoed in the suddenly silent courtroom. It was the sound of a song ending, of a ledger being closed for good. The chaos of the courthouse faded with the setting sun, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep quiet. The trial had been adjourned until morning, a mere formality now. Judge Morrow had all but fled the bench, his authority shattered. Kincaid had been taken into custody by a grim-faced Marshal Pike, his empire of paper and fear collapsing around him. The town's breath, held tight with tension all day, had finally evened out into the slow, steady rhythm of evening. As twilight settled over Dry Comet Ranch like a soft lavender and gray quilt, a sense of peace returned, deeper and more permanent than before. The air was no longer thick with the shape of trouble. It was clean, washed by the day's victory. They were stringing a new clothesline. The old one had been frayed and weak, and this simple, domestic act felt like a reassertion of life, a quiet declaration that there would be a tomorrow, and that tomorrow would have clean laundry. Colt hammered a new iron hook into the porch post while Evie held the thick, coiled rope, its clean, fibrous scent a welcome change from the dust and stale ink of the courthouse. The only light came from a single lantern placed on the porch railing, casting their shadows long and dancing against the wall of the house. The glow was soft, intimate, creating a small, golden world for the two of them in the vast, darkening landscape. Colt finished with the hammer and took the end of the rope from her. "Hold it steady," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. He walked the line out to the tall post at the edge of the yard, the rope unspooling through her hands. When he reached the far post, he pulled the rope taut. Evie braced herself, her small hands gripping the line, her feet planted in the dust. He worked on the far end, and she stood as the anchor, a mirror to his labor. When he was done, he walked back toward her, his boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch in the dirt. He came to stand beside her to check the tension of the line at the porch. Their shoulders brushed. It was an accidental, inevitable contact in the small space, but it sent a jolt, as bright and silent as heat lightning, through Evie's entire body. In the weeks before, one of them would have moved away, a quick, almost apologetic shift to reestablish the careful distance between them. But this time, neither of them did. They stood there for a long, charged moment, shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of his arms seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. They did not hurry apart. In the soft lantern light, she looked down at his hands as he tested the rope, pulling it, testing its give. She had seen these hands perform 100 tasks, and she knew them as well as she knew her own. They were large, square, and mapped with the story of his life. She saw the faint, silvery nick scars on his knuckles, ghosts of a slipped knife or a stubborn piece of machinery. She saw the deeper, permanent rope burns etched into his palms, the price of a life spent wrestling this hard land into submission. They were hands of immense strength, hands that had pinned Rudd Talbot to the ground with brutal efficiency. But she also saw the way his thumb and forefinger moved on the rope, a sure but gentle touch, assessing, not forcing. These were the same hands that had held a trembling cup steady for her, the hands that had guided her own as they learned the intricate, perfect logic of the sable-forked knot. They were hands that remembered gentleness, even when the world forgot it. They were hands that knew the difference between holding on and holding captive. The cool evening wind stirred, whispering through the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It tugged at a loose strand of her hair, brushing it across her cheek. The vastness of the night, the quiet of the ranch, the simple solidity of the man standing so close beside her, it all combined to create a space of impossible safety. A space where a question that had been living in the silent corners of her heart could finally be spoken aloud. "Is it wrong if I want you?" She asked it of the night, of the wind, her voice so low it was almost a thought. The words were a fragile offering, carried only as far as the front of his shirt. It was not a question about propriety or morals. It was a question about permission, about the landscape of her own heart, which had been a barren territory of fear for so long that the first green shoots of desire felt strange, illicit, and possibly dangerous. Colt went perfectly still. The crickets, which had been chirping their nightly chorus, seemed to fall silent. He did not turn to her immediately. He looked out at the dark line of the mesas, a deep, shuddering breath passing through him. His answer was not a speech. It was not a word. It was a movement. Slowly, with a deliberation that was both agonizing and beautiful, he turned his body to face her. He took a single, careful step closer, closing the small, respectful distance that had always remained between them. And then, he raised his hand. He did not touch her. His palm hovered in the air, an inch from her waist, suspended in the warm lantern glow. It was a question asked in the language he had promised her, the language of wanting, not taking. The space between his hand and her body was a universe of choice, a sacred ground of consent. He was waiting. A lifetime of fear and flight and survival screamed at her to step back, to retreat to the safety of solitude. But the quiet, steady warmth that had been growing inside her for weeks, a warmth built of shared coffee and mended blankets and whistled harmonies, was stronger. She looked up into his eyes, dark and deep and full of a tenderness that made her ache. She gave a small, certain nod. His hand settled at her waist. The touch was firm, gentle, grounding. His palm was warm against the small of her back, a point of contact that seemed to connect every nerve in her body. Her breath caught in her throat, a soft, sharp intake that was the softest yes a body could make. He didn't pull her to him. He simply stood there, his hand at her waist, letting her feel the weight of his touch, the reality of her choice. And then, slowly, they began to sway. There was no music but the sudden, renewed chorus of the cicadas and the whisper of the wind. It was not a dance, but a shared shifting of weight, a slow, unhurried movement that drew them closer by imperceptible degrees. His other hand came up, not to her waist, but to gently cup her elbow. Their foreheads touched. She closed her eyes, resting her weight against him, the solid wall she had stood behind for so long. She could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse in his temple against her own. His skin smelled of soap and dust and the clean night air. He asked with his eyes, a silent question for every inch he took, for the slight tilt of his head, for the closing of the final, small distance between their lips. And she answered with a soft sigh, a slight parting of her own lips, a final, complete surrender not to him, but to her own wanting. The kiss was unhurried. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate hunger. It was a kiss of discovery, of homecoming. It was soft and deep and fully chosen. It was the kind of kiss you could step back from if either heart flinched. Neither did. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and courage, of dust and dignity. It was the quiet, certain culmination of 100 small moments, of a shared cup of water, of a glance held a moment too long across a clothesline. When they finally broke apart, it was with a shared, breathless smile. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. He didn't release her. She rested her brow against his, her hands coming up to lie flat against the solid warmth of his chest. She could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. A low sound rumbled in his chest, a sound she had never heard before. He laughed. It was a quiet, amazed laugh, full of a wonder that joy could sneak up on a man like rain in the desert. "Evie," he whispered, the name a prayer against her hair. The lantern on the railing burned lower, its oil nearly spent. The golden circle of their world grew smaller, more intimate. Reluctantly, they parted, the cool night air rushing into the space between them. The new clothesline, forgotten, gleamed faintly in the starlight, a silent testament to the work they had done, to the new line they had just drawn. They stood on the porch, the comfortable silence returning, but changed now, richer. "I'll take the first watch," he said, his voice a little rough. "We'll take it together," she corrected softly. He nodded. "All right, together." They agreed on tomorrow, not with promises of forever, but with the quiet understanding that they would face it, just as they had faced everything else. There were no promises beyond honest hours, and for now, That was more than enough. As Evie turned to go inside, she looked back at the single room that had been her sanctuary. Before, it had been a place to satisfy a desperate hunger for safety. It was still safe. But now, it held something more. It held the lingering warmth of a shared laugh, of a chosen kiss, of a man's hand settled gentle and sure at her waist. The house held heat, not hunger. The difference was everything. The deep, pre-dawn cold of Juniper Hollow was a different animal from the clean chill of the open ranch. It was a still, heavy cold, trapped between the false fronts of the buildings, smelling of sour beer and desperation. Inside the marshal's office, Deputy Allen slumped in his chair, his head on his desk, his breathing a thick, oblivious rhythm. Marshal Harlan Pike sat opposite him, his boots up on his own desk, his hat tipped over his eyes. He was not asleep. He had been rereading the federal circular by the low light of a single lamp, planning his final, ironclad case for the morning. A sound, faint as a mouse's scratch, broke the silence. Scree. Pause. Scree. Pike's boots hit the floor with a soft, solid thud. The deputy snored. Pike drew his pistol, his movements fluid as water, and moved to the hallway that connected the office to the 2 cells in the back. Scree! It was the sound of a file on metal, slow, patient, and nearly finished. Pike rounded the corner. The cell holding Rudd Talbot was empty. The cell holding Bram Kincaid was not. A man Pike didn't recognize, dressed in dark clothes, was outside the bars, his arm deep inside, working on the lock of the heavy cuff Kincaid still wore. The cell bar itself, one of the older, less trusted ones, glittered with fresh, silver cut marks where it had been sawed through and bent wide. "Marshal," Kincaid said, his voice as calm as if they were meeting for cards. He didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed at the interruption. The man with the file lunged, a knife appearing in his hand. Pike didn't fire. He moved, using the man's own momentum to slam him against the stone wall. The man crumpled. Kincaid, however, was already out. He'd used the man as a diversion, slipping through the bent bar. He grabbed the deputy's dropped keys from the floor and bolted for the back door. At that exact moment, a new smell cut through the cold air of Dry Comet Ranch. It was not the clean, resinous scent of Colt's stove. It was the acrid, biting smell of dry grass catching fire. Colt and Evie, sharing the last watch on the porch, stood simultaneously. They had been sitting in the dark, speaking in low tones, their shared exhaustion a bond. Now, a new frantic energy snapped between them. "Where?" Evie whispered, her heart seizing. Colt didn't answer. He vaulted the porch railing and ran 50 yards into the open, his gaze scanning the perimeter. He stopped, his shoulders tensing. He pointed. North, the north fence line. Evie joined him, and a cold, sick dread washed over her. It wasn't a small fire. A long, thin line of orange was blooming against the dark horizon. A wicked, jagged smile. It was fast, and it was moving with the wind, not toward the house, but toward the wide-open north pasture, where the main herd was. A stampede. Colt breathed, the word a curse. "It's not a diversion. It's the plan. Kincaid's friends. They're trying to break the herd, scatter them to the winds, cover their flight and ruin me in one move." "Pike," Evie said, her mind racing. "He has Kincaid. This must be his friends." "Or Kincaid's out," Colt said, his voice flat and deadly. He was already running for the barn, his long strides eating the ground. "This is their last, worst gambit." He burst into the barn, grabbing burlap sacks and the heavy shovel. "Get the water barrels. Evie, wet the sacks." Evie ran, but not to the barrels by the porch. Her mind, now honed by weeks of survival, was thinking in seams, in breaks. The barrels were for beating, but you couldn't beat a fire that was a quarter-mile long. You had to stop it. She ran to the small spring house where they kept the milk. The 2 heavy 10-gallon metal cans from the morning's milking were full, cold, and impossibly heavy. She didn't try to lift them. She wrestled one over, bracing her body against it, and rolled it, end over end, out of the spring house, the lid rattling, the cold liquid sloshing. "Colt, I need help." He was out, his horse already saddled, the wet sacks tied behind him. He saw what she was doing, and his eyes, grim in the spreading orange glow, lit with a fierce approval. "Good girl, that's smart." He dismounted, and together they hauled the 2 massive cans up, strapping one to either side of her mare, a retired cavalry mount that was steady under pressure. Milk and water sloshed over her hands, cold as ice. "I'm going to ride to the head of it." Colt yelled over the rising roar of the flames. "I'll try to turn it back on itself. Evie, you ride the line, the seam, between the house and the fire. Use the milk, use the water, make a wet line. Don't let it jump. Do you hear me? Don't let it jump." "I hear you," she cried, pulling herself into the saddle. "And Evie," he grabbed her bridle, his face illuminated by the terrible fire, a mask of terror and trust. "If it moves too fast, you run, you save yourself. That is an order. The ranch be damned. You run." She looked down at him, this man who had offered her shelter, then his name, then his heart. "I won't run," she said, and she wheeled the horse, galloping toward the danger. Back in Juniper Hollow, Pike burst from the jail's back door just as Kincaid disappeared into the alley. He heard the sound of a horse, already saddled and waiting. Thunder out of town. He fired once into the air, a warning shot that was swallowed by the night. "Deputy, get a horse, he's heading for Dry Comet." Mary Lark, asleep in the bed of his mail wagon, was woken by the shot. He sat bolt upright, and his eyes, trained to see in the dark, saw 2 things at once: Marshal Pike, gun in hand, running for the livery, and a faint, pulsing orange glow in the sky, exactly in the direction of the Dry Comet. He understood. The law, the fire, the escape, it was all one single, terrible moment. He didn't wait. He was a small man, but he was a part of this now. He ran, not for his wagon, but for the town's bell rope, hanging outside the firehouse. He seized it, his wiry frame thrown into the air with the first pull. Clang, 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 clang! The sound was a raw, iron panic, ripping through the pre-dawn quiet. Lights flashed on in windows, doors were thrown open. "What is it?" "Fire, where's the fire?" Mary, still yanking the rope, pointed with his free hand. "Dry Comet. It's Kincaid. They've fired the ranch." Willa Thorne, in her nightgown and robe, was the first one on her porch. She saw the glow. She looked at the panicked men running for the slow, horse-drawn pump wagon. "That will be too late," she called, her voice clear and sharp as a needle. "The Creek ladies, to the Creek gentlemen, wagons and shovels. Form a bucket line. We are not losing that ranch." Her words, a call to practical, immediate action, cut through the panic. A new, organized energy surged through the street. The town, which had been a collection of whispers, had found its voice. It was a choir, and its song was the clatter of pails and the rumble of wagon wheels. The fire at the ranch was a living, breathing monster. It roared and hissed, devouring the dry grass. The heat so intense it was like a physical wall. Colt was a demon in the smoke, riding parallel to the flames, beating at the edge with his wet sack. Again and again, a desperate, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. Evie rode her line, her own personal battle. She tilted the heavy cans, one, then the other, pouring a precious, thin stream of milk and water onto the grass, creating a dark, wet seam, a fragile firebreak between the advancing flames and the home she now claimed as her own. Her eyes burned, her lungs ached, the soot thick on her face, turning the sweat on her brow to black mud. A figure burst through the wall of smoke, stumbling, coughing, his clothes smoking. It was Rudd Talbot. He had clearly been the one to light the fire, and in his incompetence, had been trapped by its sudden, explosive speed. He was wild-eyed, his face blistered, his hair singed. He looked less like a man and more like a panicked, wounded animal. He saw Evie. She was sitting on her horse, the empty milk cans dangling at her sides, her chest heaving. She was the last target, the source of all his ruin. "You!" he hacked, a wet, rattling cough. He stumbled toward her, his hand reaching out, claw-like. "You! Witch!" Evie's hands were empty. Her horse danced nervously beneath her, but she did not pull the reins. She did not turn. She had run from this man for the last time. She held her ground, her gaze locking with his, her body planted in the saddle like a fence post. A shadow detached itself from the smoke. Colt. His face was a black, unrecognizable mask, his eyes burning white with rage and exhaustion. He didn't have his rifle. He held the shovel he'd been using to throw dirt on the flames. He stepped between Evie and Talbot, planting the blade of the shovel in the ash-covered ground. It was a line drawn. "It's over, Rudd," Colt rasped, his voice thick with smoke. He didn't raise the shovel to strike. He didn't need to. He just stood there, a wall of soot-covered resolve. The promise wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The game was finished. Talbot looked from the unmoving man to the unmoving woman, and then at the wall of fire that had been his weapon and was now his prison. The last bit of fight, the last spark of pathetic malice, died in his throat. He crumpled, sagging to his knees, his body racked by a deep, shuddering cough that was the only sound he could make. But it wasn't over. "Colt!" Evie screamed, her voice high and sharp. She pointed, not at Talbot, but toward the house, which had been left undefended. Another shadow. This one was moving fast and low, away from the fire, toward the cistern and the barn. Bram Kincaid. He had used Talbot and the fire as a perfect diversion. He was at the hitching post, untying a sleek, saddled bay that Evie had never seen before. He had stashed it there. His escape was planned to the last detail. Evie didn't think. She put 2 fingers to her mouth and whistled. The sound was high, piercing, a sharp, clean cut through the roar of the fire, the signal they had practiced, the one they used when a coyote got too close to the chickens. From the main road, an answering sound, the thunder of a horse at a full, desperate gallop. Marshal Harlan Pike burst into the ranch yard, his horse lathered. He must have been tracking Kincaid, riding on instinct. He heard the whistle. He saw the scene, the fire, the town's wagons just arriving, Colt standing guard over a collapsed Talbot, and Kincaid by the barn, swinging into his saddle. Pike didn't ride to the fire. He didn't ride to Colt. He aimed his horse like a missile, directly at Kincaid. "Halt. Kincaid federal warrant." Kincaid yanked his horse's head around, fumbling in his boot for the derringer he kept there. He was fast, but Pike was faster. The marshal cut him off at the water trough, his own horse skidding on the damp ground, blocking the path to the road. Kincaid, trapped, his hand on his tiny gun, looked into the cold, iron gaze of the law. Pike didn't draw his own gun. He reached into his coat and pulled out the federal circular, shaking it open with one hand. "The game's over! Bram!" Pike said, his voice carrying over the din. "These aren't county cuffs. These are federal. And you are under arrest for conspiracy, inciting a riot, and attempted murder." Kincaid's hand dropped from his gun. He had built an empire on paper, and it was a single piece of paper that had just destroyed him. As Pike cuffed him, the town arrived. The bucket line, with Willa Thorne and Mary Lark at its head, swarmed the yard. They saw the scene: Pike with Kincaid, Colt with Talbot, Evie on her horse, watching over them all. The choir, with its frantic chanting, got to work. They formed a line from the cistern, their buckets passing hand over hand, and they fell upon the fire. They worked with shovels, sacks, and water, a grim, efficient, and united force. The fire, which had been a roaring monster, faltered, broke, and died, hissing into steam against Evie's wet seam. The north fence was a long, black scar of smoking posts. Dry Comet Ranch had lost 2 fence posts and a wide swath of grass. It had gained a town. Rudd Talbot was still on his knees, his hands now cuffed behind him. The sour, acrid stink of the oil that had been on him for a day was now mixed with the bitter smell of smoke and the undeniable stench of his own shame. He was a pathetic, broken thing, sobbing into the ash. No one cheered, no one gloated. The ranchers and seamstresses just looked at him, their faces black with soot and exhaustion. Relief was a much quieter, heavier thing than revenge. Dawn came, a slow, watercolor wash of pale pink and silver gray. The ash on the ground, still smoking, looked like a dusting of new snow. Silver in the first light. The danger, finally, was gone. Evie slid from her horse, her knees buckling as her boots hit the ground. Her body, which had been a taut wire of purpose, finally let go. Her hands, which had been so steady on the heavy milk cans and the reins, began to shake. It was a violent, uncontrollable tremor, the body's final, shuddering release of a year's worth of terror. Colt walked over to her, his own legs unsteady. He, too, was shaking with exhaustion. He stood in front of her, a man made of ash and shadow, and said nothing. He just uncorked his canteen and held it out. She took it. Her shaking hands rattled the tin against her teeth as she drank the cool, clean water. When she was done, she lowered the canteen but didn't let it go. He didn't take it back. They just stood there, holding it between them, their gazes locked. His eyes, red-rimmed from the smoke, held her, steadied her, and in their depths, she saw the quiet, unshakable promise of tomorrow. It was done. The sun was cooler the next day, its heat tempered by a high, thin veil of clouds that softened the harsh edges of the landscape. The Juniper Hollow courthouse felt different, too. The air of corrupt, suffocating authority had been broken, replaced by a quiet, watchful anticipation. Judge Elgin Morrow was on the bench when they entered, but he looked like a man who had aged a decade overnight. His face was pale and doughy, his eyes darting nervously from the packed benches to Marshal Pike, who stood by the door, a silent, unmovable sentinel. In Pike's hand was a telegram. Before the proceedings could even begin, Morrow cleared his throat, the sound a dry rattle. In light of new information, and to avoid any appearance of impropriety, he mumbled, not looking at anyone, I find it necessary to recuse myself from this case. He stood, his movements stiff, and practically fled the room through his private chambers, a man running from his own shadow. A new man entered, a circuit magistrate sent by the territorial judge in Prescott, summoned by Pike's urgent telegram. He was a thin, severe-looking man with spectacles and a no-nonsense demeanor, a man who dealt in facts, not favors. He took the bench, his presence immediately lending a new, clean weight to the proceedings. He read the charges, his voice crisp and clear, the words sounding clean and sharp against the dusty wooden rafters. Against Bram Kincaid, conspiracy to defraud, attempted arson, unlawful restraint, and violation of Federal Circular 72 against Rudd Talbot, Knox Talbot and Plume Talbot, conspiracy and attempted arson. There was no mention of chattel or property. These were the names of crimes, plain and simple, and Bram Kincaid stood in the prisoner's box, his fine suit rumpled, the scent of bay rum replaced by the sour smell of fear. His quick, intelligent eyes, which had always counted the odds, now counted the exits. He found none. The deputies at the door, the stern magistrate on the bench, the sea of unforgiving faces in the crowd, every door was locked. Rudd Talbot, beside him, was a collapsed and broken thing. When asked for his plea, he mumbled a deal his lawyer had clearly just made. pleading guilty to the lesser charges in exchange for testimony against Kincaid. Evie didn't watch him. She didn't need to see his final humiliation. Her gaze was fixed on the tall, wavy glass window to her left. Through it, she could see a slice of the vast blue sky, a sky that had once been her oppressor, a symbol of the endless, hopeless road. Now, it was just sky. It was a promise of open spaces, of tomorrows, of a life that was finally, truly, her own. The past was a room she was finally walking out of, and she had no desire to look back at the furniture. The clerk, a small, meticulous man who had served under Morrow with a perpetually worried expression, now seemed to stand a little straighter. He called Evie forward, not to testify, but to sign a document. By the authority of the territorial government and the witness of Marshal Harlan Pike, the magistrate announced, the court recognizes the filing of a formal statement of sanctuary for Miss Evie Hartwell. Her legal address, for all official purposes, is hereby recorded as the Dry Comet Ranch, Painted Mesa County. The clerk pushed the heavy ledger across the table toward her and offered her a pen. Sign here, Miss Hartwell, as a resident. She looked at the blank line. Beside it, 2 names were already there. Marshal Pike had signed as the legal authority, and below that, in a strong, clear hand that was as solid and uncompromising as the man himself, was the signature of Colt Merrick. He had not signed as her protector, or her guardian. He had signed on the line marked witness and neighbor. It was a gesture of profound respect, acknowledging her as an independent person, his equal. She took the pen. The ink was black and wet. She thought of Kincaid's ledger, of the way her name had been a mere entry, a commodity. She dipped the pen, and for the first time in a long, long time, she signed her own name, not the hurried, fearful scrawl she had used on false documents, but a steady, deliberate signature, Evie Hartwell. The ink flowed, clean and dark, a definitive, final claim on her own life. When the court was adjourned and Kincaid was led away in federal custody, a new chapter began on the dusty street outside. As Evie and Colt stepped into the sunlight, the town was waiting, but they were not there to stare or to gawk. They were there to welcome one of their own. An old rancher she didn't know pressed a small, leather-bound book of poetry into her hands. "For the quiet nights, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. Mary Lark gave her a bundle of ribbons, their colors bright as wildflowers. "For your hair," he said, a wide grin splitting his face. "A celebration." Then Willa Thorne bustled through the crowd, her face set with a determined kindness. "Well, that's that," she said, taking Evie by the arm. "Now, we can't have you living on that ranch in a borrowed dress and a man's shirt. Come with me." She led Evie to her shop, the bell above the door tinkling a cheerful welcome. Inside, bolts of fabric were stacked like promises. Willa didn't ask what she wanted. She had already decided. She held up a length of blue calico, the color of a twilight sky, patterned with tiny white flowers. "This one," Willa said, her voice firm. "It's a good, sturdy fabric. It'll stand up to work, but it's got a bit of grace to it. It's work-worthy," she added, giving Evie a sharp, knowing look. Not wedding loud. She was giving Evie not just a dress, but a future, one of practical dignity, not of prescribed roles. She was giving her a choice, even in the pattern of her clothes. Back at the ranch, the world felt new, as if it had been taken apart, cleaned, and put back together correctly. The air was clear, the sky a deep, untroubled blue. The ugly, black scar of the fire was still there, a reminder of the justice that had cost something. But new shoots of green were already visible at its edges. Colt was already at work, his quiet, constant energy a comforting presence. He was up on the windmill derrick, applying a new coat of black tar to the pump rod, sealing it against the weather. The windmill's tick was no longer just a sound, it was a rhythm, the steady, reassuring beat of a clock that had finally been properly wound. When he finished, he re-greased the squeaky pulley, and the shriek that had once made Evie laugh was replaced by a smooth, quiet whir. The cistern's rope, newly tarred, ran over it without a sound, a silent, efficient servant. That afternoon, Evie took her new dress from its paper wrapping, the scent of Willa's shop, of clean fabric and purpose. Clung to it. She didn't put it on. Instead, she took it outside and hung it on the new clothesline, letting it catch the breeze, letting it become a part of the ranch's air. Colt was at his workbench on the porch, mending a piece of harness, his back to her. He had seen her come out with the blue bundle. He tried to pretend he wasn't watching. He focused with an absurd intensity on a single buckle, polishing it with a scrap of leather. But she saw the way his shoulders were tensed, the way his head was angled just so. He was pretending not to see, and he was failing adorably. A laugh, real and full and unburdened, bubbled up from deep inside her. It was a sound of pure joy, and it took the room like a sudden flood of sunlight, chasing out the last of the shadows. He finally gave up his pretense, turning, a slow, wonderful smile spreading across his face, a smile that reached all the way to his tired, beautiful eyes. At dusk, they walked, not with any destination in mind, but just to feel the cooling air on their skin. Their path took them to the south gate, the place where the drag gate had slammed, where the trip line had once sung its song of defiance. They stood there for a long time, the silence between them comfortable, complete. The scarred earth was a testament to the battle they had fought and won together. She turned to him. The sky behind him was turning a deep, burnished copper, the color of a cooling ember. This time, she didn't ask. She didn't need to. She stepped into the circle of his arms, a quiet, certain homecoming. His arms closed around her, holding her with a gentle strength that was now as familiar as her own heartbeat. Their boots were soft in the dust as they began to sway, a quiet dance with no music but the whisper of the evening wind and the distant call of a lone coyote. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. He rested his cheek against her hair, breathing in her scent. A man amazed to find peace had ambushed him so completely. He reached for her waist, his touch sure, confident. There was no hesitation now, no hovering question. It was the touch of a man who knew he was wanted, who knew he was home. And she rose onto her toes, lifting her face to his, choosing him again, freely and completely, as the last light of the day bled from the sky. The wind, whispering through the mended fences, spoke of tomorrow. The warm light spilling from the open door of the house spoke of staying, and their joined hands, clasped tight in the beautiful, quiet twilight, said that on Dry Comet Ranch, both could be true. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story be heard by even more people, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button